The caste system, or Varna as it is traditionally known in India, refers to broad social categories that group people by common interests and vocations. The hierarchy among these castes is historically based on the perceived importance of each role in sustaining society. In India, there are four main castes. At the top, we have Brahmins, or priestly class, who are responsible for spiritual guidance, education, and conducting rituals. Next, we have the Kshatriya, the warrior class, who are traditionally tasked with governance, defense, and maintaining justice. The Vaishyas comprise merchants, farmers, and administrators who manage trade and economic activities. Lastly, the Shudras represent the working class, manual laborers, artisans, and service providers. It's also worth noting that traditionally, your caste wasn't strictly defined by family inheritance based on your last name as it is done today in India. Caste was more fluid in a more traditional India, and there was a sense of caste mobility or fluidity if you could demonstrate that your nature was more befitting of a different caste. While some critics argue that the caste system is merely a Hindu superstition, similar social hierarchies have existed in nearly all civilizations prior to the modern liberal era. Moreover, these four Varnas can be seen as archetypes that reflect different phases in human history, with each caste predominating during distinct historical epochs depending on the prevailing values and societal structure. The four epochs. Throughout history, we can identify four major epochs in which the dominance of different Varnas or castes shaped the character of civilizations. Each era reflects a shift in societal organization and values, moving from greater to lesser degrees of spiritual orientation. The first and most spiritually elevated is the sacred era, marked by the predominance of the Brahmins, or priestly class. In this epoch, which characterizes many ancient civilizations, spiritual life was central. Priests, while often not directly involved in governance, held the highest authority through their role as spiritual guides and custodians of sacred knowledge and rituals. Following this came the warrior era, defined by the ascendancy of the Kshatriya class. The third is the mercantile or bourgeois era, in which the Vaishyas, merchants, landowners, and administrators rose to prominence. Lastly, we enter the era of the mass man, dominated by the Shudras, or working class. This epoch corresponds to the rise of democratic, socialist, and communist ideologies in later modern times. Historically, the early civilizations upheld the spiritual class as the highest authority. Although Brahmins rarely governed directly, they played a central role in shaping societal values through spiritual instruction and ritual leadership. As time progressed, particularly from the classical era through to the French Revolution in the West, power increasingly shifted towards the warrior or mercantile classes. This transformation is often seen as a civilizational turning point, one in which the traditional order began to unravel, leading to a perceived decline in spiritual orientation and societal harmony. While there is no universally agreed upon event that marks the precise transition from one epoch to another, certain historical moments stand out as significant turning points. One such moment is found in the Middle Ages, particularly during the investiture controversy, a struggle between royalty and clergy. This conflict came to a head in the power struggle between the Ghibellines, who supported the imperial authority of the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Guelphs, who aligned with the papacy. Ultimately, the Guelphs prevailed, and as a result, the spiritual authority was consolidated solely under the Pope, separate from the temporal power of kings and emperors. This marked a decisive split between the clergy and the nobility. To understand the significance of this shift, it's worth recalling that in the ancient Roman Empire, the emperor himself held the title of Pontifex Maximus, literally the greatest bridge builder between the earthly and the divine. While there were priests who also bore the title Pontifex, the emperor embodied both spiritual and temporal authority. He was in essence both ruler and high priest. The investiture controversy then, later on in the Holy Roman Empire, in the Germanic Frankish Empire, symbolizes a key moment in Western civilization when the unity of spiritual and worldly power began to fracture. setting the stage for the later rise of secularism, the division of church and state, and the reorientation of society away from integrated spiritual political leadership. This transition can take different forms across civilizations. In some cases, the warrior class remains guided by the priestly class, allowing war and governance to retain a sense of a sacred purpose, such as in the Middle Ages, where military power was still deeply connected to spiritual authority. In other cases, however, the warrior class breaks away from its spiritual roots entirely, leading to a loss of that sacred dimension. Broadly speaking, this era is categorized by a growing separation between political and spiritual authority. The nobility and ruling classes began to operate separate from the priesthood, with their interests and values increasingly diverging. This marks a fundamental shift in the structure of society, where once spiritual guidance shaped political action, now the two spheres begin to drift apart. In Europe, particularly during the late Middle Ages, mercantile republics like Genoa and the Republic of Venice began to emerge and thrive. The city-states grew in wealth and influence, setting the stage for a broader societal shift. By the time of the discovery of the New World and the rise of colonial powers, it became increasingly clear that the third caste, or the third estate, made up of merchants, bankers, and administrators, was beginning to dominate society. The rise of the Italian communes marked the birth of civic nationalism, a shift in identity where individuals were no longer just subjects of a king, but members of a nation. Leadership moved away from hereditary warrior-like elites towards officials chosen for their administrative skills, often from non-noble backgrounds. This shift culminated in major events like the French Revolution and the reforms of Napoleon, who, among other things, liberated certain ethnic groups from ghettos in places like Germany. These changes helped pave the way for the emergence of influential banking families and the broader social transformation that followed. All of this contributed to the rise of the liberal left, a political and social movement rooted in the values and interests of the mercantile caste. For some, this represents yet another turning point in the gradual decline of traditional civilization, as older hierarchies and spiritual foundations gave way to a new, more materialistic order. In the West, the culminating event that best marks this transition is the French Liberal Revolution. Then, in the so-called liberal era, the spiritual bond between priests and the common people begins to fade. Rulers are no longer seen as noble warriors with historical and cultural legitimacy, and the old feudal relationships, once built on mutual loyalty and respect between the sovereign and the people, begin to dissolve. During this time, history is often rewritten to favor the bourgeoisie, portraying their rise as inevitable progress. Monarchs are then reimagined as tyrants who ruled without any moral or legitimate authority, while democracy, presented as the pinnacle of political evolution, is little more than a ritual of participation that offers little real power to the people. This new system, in many ways, encourages plebeian involvement in politics and their admission into positions of power without necessarily providing meaningful agency or deeper societal cohesion. As secularism grows, spirituality is increasingly treated as a private or personal matter, disconnected from the politics that define civilization. Meanwhile, the working class or proletariat feels increasingly disillusioned, as the promises of equality and progress made by the bourgeois elite often go unfulfilled, and frustration, turmoil, and resentment towards their leadership quickly grows. This discontent sets the stage for the rise of communism, where power begins to shift into the hands of the fourth caste or the fourth estate. This marks the beginning of the fourth epoch, an era symbolized by the violent upheaval of the Russian Revolution and the spread of socialist, social democratic, and communist movements across the globe. Societies and politics, as we know, are largely shaped by their elites, and the dominant caste of each era influences not just politics and economics, but also the spiritual, cultural, and societal direction of civilization. Everything from art and architecture to family structures and core societal values reflects the worldview of the ruling class at the time. The first epoch, the Sacred Era. In this era, society was oriented toward harmony with the world, with God, and with reality itself. Spirituality was central, and life was seen as a path of alignment with a higher cosmic order. The priestly class shaped the values of society, prioritizing wisdom, ritual, and transcendence. Then in the second epoch, the Warrior Era, as warriors rose to power, the cultural focus shifted to values such as bravery, honor, loyalty, discipline, and duty. This era emphasized action, hierarchy, and sacrifice for a greater cause, often the defense or expansion of the nation. The warrior's code influenced both governance and daily life. In the bourgeois era, the third epoch, with the rise of the mercantile class, ideology became centered on material prosperity, individualism, and so-called individual rights, which from a traditional point of view can be seen as instruments of social fragmentation. Wealth and economic power became the primary measure of success. Usury, once prohibited by religious law, becomes normalized, and both personal and national worth and value are reduced to financial metrics. Then, in the fourth epoch, as society moves away from the bourgeois era into the modern age, new ideologies emerged. One's focused less on virtue or responsibility and more on egalitarianism in all forms, economic equality, gender equality, equality of outcomes, and even the notion that every vote or opinion has equal wealth. These ideas, while often seen as progressive, also reflect a shift towards uniformity and the erosion of traditional hierarchies and values. In the modern era, ideas and cultural influence have largely fallen into the hands of what could be considered the most spiritually profane segment of society. As a result, quantity begins to be valued over quality. This is most certainly seen in the rise of what is commonly called democracy, a system where truth and legitimacy are no longer rooted in wisdom, virtue, courage, or experience, but are instead determined by sheer numbers. In this context, the inherent differences between individuals, whether spiritual, intellectual, or even biological, are often ignored or denied altogether. The notion of natural hierarchies or merit becomes so unpopular or even offensive. Excellence, once admired and aspired to, is often seen as with suspicion or dismissed as elitism or unfairness. At the same time, manual labor and physical effort are elevated as the primary measure of human worth. Work is valued not for its ingenuity, technical skill, or contribution to higher aims, but for its perceived difficulty or physical intensity. This mindset gives rise to popular formulas such as work dignifies or he who does not work does not eat, expressions that reflect a mass man-oriented worldview where function is emphasized over purpose and utility over meaning. Architecture and art serve as reflections of a society's deepest values and ideals. As different castes rise to prominence, the orientation of creative expression shifts accordingly, moving from the sacred to the utilitarian. In the earliest era, architecture had a transcendental purpose. Temples and sacred structures were designed not merely for function, but as symbolic representations of metaphysical truths. Their beauty was rooted in spiritual harmony, with every element reflecting cosmic principles and guiding the observer toward contemplation and higher understandings. In the warrior era, as the warrior caste rose to prominence, architecture took on a more practical and militaristic function. Castles, fortresses, and walled cities emerged, designed to protect the ruling class and the population in an unstable, often violent world. While still impressive and monumental, these structures emphasize strength, hierarchy, and security over spiritual symbolism. With the ascent of the third caste, architecture began to focus more on beauty for its own sake. The bourgeois, with a refined taste, contributed to elegant and aesthetical rich designs. However, lacking a spiritual foundation, architecture became increasingly personal and subjective, without higher principles to guide them. Architects built according to individual perception, often leading to visual and philosophical disarray, what could be called chaos within chaos. The built environment began to drift away from nature's patterns and deeper symbolism. In the final stage, architecture becomes purely utilitarian. Both spiritual meaning and aesthetic sensibility are abandoned in favor of efficiency, cost saving, and mass production. This shift gives rise to styles such as brutalism and the standardized impersonal apartment blocks, often referred to by Julius Evola as the hives of the masses. Art likewise becomes less about beauty or originality and more about promoting political ideas or indulging in surface level pleasures, reflecting the values of a society that has turned away from transcendence. The family too is also influenced by the spiritual quality of each era. In the first epoch, the family was seen as a microcosm of the cosmos. It wasn't just a domestic arrangement, but a sacred institution reflecting metaphysical principles. Father, he was the moral and ritual guide of the household. This authority wasn't based merely on power, but on his connection to Dharma, cosmic order, and his capacity to transmit spiritual and ancestral knowledge. The family had a sacramental function, particularly in transmitting tradition across generations. Children were not just raised, they were initiated into the customs, duties, and spiritual teachings of the family and caste. Lineage was essential. It carried not just a name, but spiritual responsibility and ancestral legacy. Ancestor veneration played a major role in maintaining the spiritual bond across generations. Traditionalist views emphasize hierarchy, not as oppression, but as natural order. The husband led spiritually and temporally. The wife had a sacred, feminine role as the keeper of customs and fertility, seen not as inferior, but complementary and essential. Gender roles were seen as metaphysical expressions, or in Western terms, the solar and lunar principles. Marriage in a transcendental epoch was not a contract, but a ritual consecration, a sacrament that united two lineages under divine law. It wasn't based on personal desire or affection alone, but duty, spiritual harmony. This union was meant to continue the transmission of tradition. Then in the warrior epoch, the family adopts a more strictly hierarchical and patriarchal structure. The father holds absolute authority, more akin to a commander than a spiritual guide. This model reflects the values of the time: discipline, strength, loyalty, conflict readiness. Such a structure was seen as essential for survival in a dangerous world and for maintaining a society capable of withstanding adversity and war. As society transitions towards the third epoch, this traditional modern begins to fragment. Families shift from large, extended, clan-like units, often bound to the land and lineage, into smaller, nuclear units. In the bourgeois age, the role of the father becomes secularized and diminished. The family is no longer a sacred institution, but increasingly resembles a practical, legal contract between equals, aimed at maximizing financial stability and material comfort. This model facilitates geographical mobility, uprooting families from their ancestral ties to the land in order to better serve the needs of the new bourgeois, commercial, and industrial elite. Over time, in the comfort and relative peace provided by bourgeois rule, traditional masculine virtues begin to erode. Marriage loses its spiritual and cultural depth, becoming more of an economic arrangement, often framed in terms that favor women's interests. Men are encouraged towards passivity and softness, gradually losing the respect of women. In this environment, the family begins to unravel. The rise of single motherhood becomes normalized, and with it a growing acceptance of family models detached from traditional norms, including same-sex couples and other modern abominations. In the end of times, the role of the family continues to decline. The state increasingly intervenes and encroaches itself in domestic life, assuming authority once held by the father, particularly in matters related to discipline, education, and moral guidance. In this era, families that attempt to retain autonomy or pass on traditional values may find themselves under suspicion, criticism, and even prosecution. Functional, stable, prosperous family units are no longer seen as aspirational, but as unjust privileges in comparison to less stable social arrangements. Social policies start being drafted to tax those who are further ahead in order to subsidize lesser family models. This shift is often justified in the name of fairness or equality, but in reality it reflects an attempt to placate the resentment of those who spawn from failed family arrangements. At this stage, the state's goal is to ultimately destroy all family ties and take charge of upbringing as a whole. Other castes. Across different cultures, additional castes or social classifications may exist beyond the four commonly recognized in the traditional Indo-Aryan system. In Bharat or India, for example, a fifth caste is recognized, known as the Dalits or outcasts. The term reflects their exclusion from the traditional Varna hierarchy. Dalits typically include individuals born into this group or those whose parentage crosses caste boundaries. The roles in society have historically been associated with tasks considered spiritually impure, such as waste disposal, street cleaning, handling corpses, and other forms of menial labor. In other civilizations, this fifth stratum is often equivalent to slaves or serfs. For instance, in ancient Rome, the concept of the slave was sometimes conflated with that of the laborer or worker, blurring the distinction between servitude and low-status labor. Among the most prominent thinkers to draw attention to the spiritual and hierarchical dimensions of history are Evola and Guénon, and they both assert that in epochs of high spiritual order, the ideal ruler is not merely political but also spiritual, some sort of priest-king, right? This fusion of roles reflects the metaphysical harmony of temporal and divine governance. However, Evola introduces a unique perspective by suggesting that the true ascetic caste is not the Brahmin priest, but a warrior priest, a figure who embodies both active rulership and spiritual transcendence. He refers to this as the royal caste, or the caste of kings, known in Indian tradition as Rajanya. This group is seen as superior even to the Brahmins, that their ascetic path involves mastery through action. By contrast, some cultures, such as the ancient Persians, do not clearly distinguish between the third and fourth castes. This reflects their shared Aryan origins with the early Indo-Aryans and Europeans. According to some interpretations, the fourth caste may have emerged from the subjugation of indigenous Dravidian peoples by Indo-Aryan conquerors, leading to a racialized aspect of caste stratification in later Indian history. In this view, the lower caste status was not only a matter of vocation, but also a result of perceived spiritual and racial inferiority. In Europe, the third estate, including all those who did not belong to the clergy or the first estate, royalty or nobility, the second estate. The term fourth estate was employed in later time to differentiate the bourgeoisie from the proletariat. Other subcastes, such as artisans, may be part of the third or fourth estate, respectively, depending on the civilization. In Bharat, a distinction is also made between the Adivasis, or autonomous original peoples, whose social organization is not analogous to the previous caste.